Tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern over on Gator 8, a new college football video drops. And now, on with our feature presentation. One of the great things about the NFL is the mantra of any given Sunday. That's the idea that each week is a brand new week, and that no matter how good a team is entering the game, or how bad a team is entering the game, you never know what's going to happen. An expansion team going on the road and defeating the defending Super Bowl champion? Sure. A team with absolutely nothing to play for, and the worst record in football, defeating a team fighting for their playoff lives? Why not? A team defeating an undefeated team and one of the greatest teams ever assembled in the Super Bowl? Go for it. You never know how a game is going to play out, and which version of a team will show up. Except for one time. This is Baltimore Colts head coach Frank Kush, and to say that his time in the NFL was a disaster would be putting it lightly. Heck, I've already done a video about how bad of a coach he was, and an incredibly dumb decision he made in 1984 when his Colts were in Indianapolis and were playing the St. Louis Cardinals. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, because 2 years before that, he took a rather interesting approach in his press conference before the game and in meeting with his reporters. Because prior to a game against the New York Jets, he said in no uncertain terms, "Don't expect anything. We're not going to win this game. We flat out suck." That's always a good sign when your head coach is saying that, and it led to incredibly predictable results. This is the story behind Frank Kush and one of the craziest pregame moments in the over 70-year history of the Colts franchise. Before I talk about the actual comments in question, we need some context to understand how the Colts were doing, as well as the landscape of the NFL going into this game, because some outside events played a pretty big part in Kush's sentiment. The year is 1982, and the Baltimore Colts, after an awful 1981 season under head coach Mike McCormack where they went 2-14, decided it was time for a coaching change. With that, they brought in Frank Kush, the highly troubled yet highly successful coach at Arizona State for more than 2 decades who led the program to 9 conference titles and made them one of the most successful programs on the West Coast. Right off the bat, he knew that the Colts weren't exactly the most talented team on paper. Heck, they were 2-14 the year before for a reason. And there's only so much you can do to fix that. So he was going to get around that by making sure that they were the most well-conditioned team in the league. It's very similar to the Herb Brooks strategy for Team USA at the 1980 Winter Olympics. As Kush said during that first offseason, when he was working the players like crazy, they say athletes are going to get into shape on their own. But I don't believe that. It's boring. It's terrible. Athletes won't get into the idea of conditioning unless they are supervised. God only gave them so much talent. We can't do anything about that. If they aren't better than the guys they go up against, we'll at least make sure they can outlast them. And Kush worked his players into shape like very few coaches in NFL history have. Assistant coach Hal Hunter said on Kush's philosophy, "Kush probably employs conditioning more than any other coach in the league." And defensive coordinator Bud Carson echoed that statement, saying that the Colts were the best conditioned athletes in the league. For some perspective on how effective Kush's conditioning program was, in May, 4 of the 5 tight ends registered a score of 0 in the leg press. 2 months later, tight end Reese McCall posted a 24. As a side note, to learn more about the career of Reese McCall, click the card in the upper right corner. Offensive lineman Ken Huff went from 0 to 20, and offensive lineman Ben Utt went from 5 reps on the leg press to 38. The Colts, on average, increased their vertical jump by 3.5 inches. And Kush was big on running. He had his players routinely do 1.5-mile runs, where they had to complete it in under 12 minutes if they were a lineman, or 10 minutes if they were at any other position. And he had his players run 10 40-yard dashes with a 30-second break in between each one, needing to complete 7 of the 10 dashes within 0.4 of a second of their best 40-yard dash time. As an example, if a player ran a 4.6 at the 40, he'd have to run 7 of the 10 dashes in under 5 seconds. He would even send his team out on Mondays from time to time to do a 4-mile run through the woods. Kush really wanted to emphasize stamina and conditioning, and he truly went the extra mile to make sure that his team was in the best possible shape. And even though the Colts weren't a good team at all through the first 2 games of 1982, starting the season 0-2, they surprised a ton of people with just how competitive they were, in particular with their Week 2 game against the Miami Dolphins on the road. Even though the Dolphins entered this game as 12.5-point favorites and jumped out to an early 14-0 lead at the end of the first quarter, the Colts battled back, actually had the lead at the half, and only lost by 4, with Dolphins head coach Don Shula praising the Colts for how they battled back. Again, the Colts weren't good, but they were extremely well conditioned, and nothing was going to stop that. The only thing that could stop that is if, I don't know, there was a 2-month-long strike that halted play and prevented the coaches from continuing to work with their players, leading to the conditioning of the players getting worse. Sure enough, after the Dolphins game, there was a 2-month-long strike that halted play and prevented the coaches from continuing to work with the players, leading to the conditioning of the players getting worse. The 1982 season was all sorts of bizarre for a variety of reasons, and you can learn more about the strike and some of the weird things that came from it by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, when the strike finally ended, after 2 long and painful months, the Baltimore Colts had a big game coming up on the road against the New York Jets. Even with the expanded playoff field, with only 7 games left in the season, and with the Colts having yet to win a game so far, the Colts had to win this one. This was a must-win, because good luck making the playoffs if you start 0-3. But in many ways, the strike leveled the playing field. All the work they did in the preseason with learning the playbook and getting momentum and getting into game shape was thrown out the window, as we were starting from scratch. Even though there were different ideas from different coaches about how the football would look after the strike, and whether it would be more beneficial for the offensive side or the defensive side of the ball, everyone was excited that football was back, and everyone believed that their team would come back enthusiastic with a chance at winning the game. That is, everyone except for Frank Kush, because when he met with reporters prior to the team's comeback game against the Jets, he bluntly said, "Yeah, we suck. We're not winning. Keep your expectations low, because I promise you, we are not winning on Sunday." That's right. Imagine a coach flat out telling the press and telling the fans before the game in a completely non-joking manner and in a way that's not used as a motivational tactic whatsoever, like we've seen other coaches try to do, that they're better off not watching, because his team is not going to win the game. Remember when, a decade and a half before this, the Jets played the Colts in the Super Bowl, and Joe Namath guaranteed that the Jets would win the game? In this battle between the same two teams, this was the anti-guarantee. Frank Kush was saying, "We're going to lose this game. I guarantee it." As a side note, to learn more about Namath's famous guarantee in an absolutely bizarre video I made more than 2 years ago, click the card in the upper right corner. Kush knew that his team wasn't talented, and more so than any other team in football, they were going to be the ones impacted by the strike, because they relied so heavily on conditioning. And now, all that conditioning was thrown out the window. Remember when Kush said that you have to coach conditioning because you can't trust the players to do it on their own? That was a scary bit of foreshadowing, because when the Colts returned from the strike, with about 4 days to get ready for their first competitive football game in 2 months, they looked awful, and were a far cry from the team that Kush built up over the summer. According to reports, and by Kush's own account, the timing on the running plays was all off, and when it came to something simple like executing a screen pass, they looked atrocious. Kush estimated that the team was about 30% less effective than they were over the summer. Now, Kush could have said that it was natural for there to be some sloppiness and things to work on after such a long layoff, and that his problems weren't unique, but he was expecting an intense, good game of football and a good second half to the season. Instead, Kush did the exact opposite, and encouraged any Colts fans who were excited to watch their team again to not be excited, because they were going to stink. Kush said, "The more talented teams will have that much more of an edge in a situation like this one. Not only can they lean on their ability, but they can play on experience alone. Enthusiasm and conditioning, which can sometimes overcome talent, aren't as much of a factor when you haven't played in 8 weeks." And if that wasn't subtle enough that Kush was basically saying that his team was going to suck, like the drunk guy at karaoke who says he's sorry for what you're about to hear before busting into the worst and longest rendition of American Pie you're ever going to hear in your life, he then apologized in advance for what was about to unfold on Sunday during the game, saying, "I really wouldn't expect too much." We've seen coaches acknowledge the fact that they're underdogs before, but I don't think in my life I've ever heard a coach in the National Football League so blatantly say before the game even kicked off that his team wasn't going to be good, and that he didn't think they were going to win. We've seen coaches say this to their players before in a bizarre motivational attempt in the locker room. If you want to learn more about one of those instances, where New York Jets head coach Ken Shipp tried to do this prior to a game against the St. Louis Cardinals, and it ended in a disastrous and predictable result, click the card in the upper right corner. But to admit this to the fans and to the public? Just thinking about it from a business perspective, if I'm NBC and I have to televise this game, I am absolutely fuming and raising hell. You're telling me that after a 2-month strike, the game I have to show is a game where the coach is conceding defeat before kickoff? No wonder after the game, cornerback Dwayne Osteen said that Kush didn't do a good job preparing his team for the game. Osteen got cut immediately afterwards for those remarks, but he's got a point. Hard to believe in a coach who doesn't believe in you and is telling anyone who will listen that you won't win the game. And sure enough, when it was time for this Jets-Colts game to play out on the field, Frank Kush was right. It took the Jets just 5 plays to march 69 yards down the field on their opening drive. And that was a pretty good omen for how this game was going to go, and for how badly the Colts were about to get manhandled. Because the Colts laid an egg and lost by an embarrassing shutout score of 37-0. It was one of the worst losses in franchise history. Everything about this game for Baltimore was ugly with a capital U. And the game was so bad that I'm guessing a ton of Baltimore fans were hoping that the team would go back on strike. At least they wouldn't be disappointed on their Sundays anymore after devoting time and energy and maybe even money to watching this mess. The Jets led at 27-0 at the half. They had 5 drives in the first half, and they scored on all 5 drives, before taking their foot off the gas after they jumped out to a 34-0 lead in the third quarter, leading the Jets to put in their backups. The Jets picked up 476 yards on total offense on an average of over 6.4 yards per play, and picked up 29 first downs. The Colts could not tackle to save their lives. It was truly some of the worst tackling I've ever seen in my life, and there's a reason why afterwards Frank Kush made his team practice in full pads. New York had 227 rushing yards and over 5.4 yards per carry, while the Colts averaged nearly 2 yards less than that, only picking up 3.5 yards per carry. Colts quarterback Mike Pagel completed just 50% of his passes and threw 2 second-half interceptions. No player on the Colts had a run longer than 10 yards, and the Colts turned it over 3 times, twice on Pagel interceptions and once on a fumble early in the game. Kush was disgusted by the game that he saw coming from a mile away and that he predicted, saying, "It was a disgrace to football. It was just a pathetic performance. There's not a hell of a lot more you could say about it. We just stunk up the joint." And when Kush was asked if he saw anything encouraging, he said, "Yeah, the end of the game." For what it's worth, the Colts finished that 1982 season with a record of 0-8-1, going winless and becoming just the second team since the merger, alongside the expansion Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 1976, to finish this season without winning a game. At least with the number 1 pick, they could draft the quarterback. Wonder how that worked out. So what's the moral of the story? If you're a head coach, it's probably not a good idea to flat out tell people that you're not going to win the game. And then when you don't win the game, don't be furious and upset when you knew for a fact that this was going to happen, and you outright predicted it and told everyone about it. Kush was an absolutely terrible head coach in the NFL. His skills did not translate from the college level to the NFL level, as in his 3 seasons with the Colts, he went 11-28-1, finishing with a winning percentage of just 28%. And if there was any one incident that showcases just how bad of a coach he was, and just how out of his element he was in the pros, it was this first game back from the 1982 strike against the Jets. Because it's hard to have any hope and faith and belief in your team when the head coach himself is telling you that you shouldn't have that. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9. To see college football videos, subscribe to JaguarGator8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.